There are a few things that I would like to go over about the syllabus. The rest of the information is there for you to read, and you can look at it at your leisure. First thing, room and meeting time. Make sure you know this. I also want to point out my office hours. On Wednesday afternoon, sometimes I have meetings, sometimes I don't. So give a call or send an email and see if that's the only time that works for you, if I can make it. Otherwise, sometimes I have availability on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and so on. Um, but make sure that you always email me or notify me prior to, because even when I have office hours, sometimes somebody else has scheduled an appointment. Sometimes I'm called into a meeting or something like that. So make sure that you let me know that you're coming. As far as the course objectives go, um, you can read about them right here. The thing I want to point out is that there are things I want you to be able to know and understand. There are things I want you to be able to do. And there are things that I want you to be able to feel. In other words, your values and your interests. As far as the cognitive objectives go, this is all the stuff that I want you to know and understand. The big things about this class are being able to understand what assessment is all about. You're trying to measure invisible things, and that's not always easy. Um, Being able to talk to parents about it, being able to talk to principals about it, if you're on a job interview or something like that, being able to interpret standardized tests, know what they're good for and what they're not good for, think about grades in a much more critical way, and really take all these principles that we're going to talk about and apply them to your life much more broadly, because all of these concepts that we go into don't just matter for trying to figure out if students know something or not, but they also matter for trying to figure out if your life is in the right place, if you're in the right profession, if you're happy with your job, your spouse, or whatever relationship you might be in, whether you have enough, whether or not your life is fulfilling, whether or not you're saving enough money for retirement. These are all questions that I'm going to kind of bring in to the class as well when we have time at the end about how these concepts can really apply to your life. The rest of this you can go over in more detail by yourself. The other things that I really want to point out are the course requirements and grading scale. Now, the grades in this class are basically computed by me gathering a bunch of evidence about all these different things that you're doing. Weekly readings, responses, and quizzes. Attendance is going to matter. It's not that big of a deal. For each class you miss, there'll be a 0.1 point deduction from your overall grade. When we get to the grading system, you see that you have 10 points. So it's really a 1% deduction from your overall grade. Not that big of a deal, but they can add up rather quickly. And I'll talk to you about the percentages in a minute. There are really 10 major categories of skills that I am going to be focusing on, and they're listed right here with their relative weights. The most important three are validity, reliability, and bias, validity being the most important thing. Um, Throughout the semester, I will be getting evidence of whether or not you can do this. Basically, for this first one, we're going to be focusing on this in the next week or so. Understanding basic cognitive theory as it relates to learning and assessment. So, what does it mean to think? What habits of thinking matter? What are the different types of thinking that you can have? What should you be trying to do as a teacher, and so on? And that's only about 5%. This one in particular we'll talk about early, and then there'll be some evidence for it as we go forward, but not a ton. Other areas like validity, reliability, and bias, we're going to talk about a lot early in the first 5 weeks. Um, but I will be continuing to get evidence throughout the next parts of the class about how well you understand these things. Um, One of the major things that you'll be doing is creating some assessments, and it's a project. You will be doing it by yourself. You'll have about a week to do it, and you will be applying all these principles and ideas. We'll have lots of practice to get you ready for that. Don't worry. And as we go through, you can see the list of topics. Now, the way that I'm going to be grading or gathering evidence really about whether or not you can do these things is by looking at how well you do on these things, but mostly how well you do on the integrated summative assessments. During weekly readings, responses, and quizzes, I expect that you will be learning things, that your skills will be getting better. So if you do poorly on a quiz, it's not going to be that big of a deal if later on a test or in the project or later on you want to come and meet with me, you demonstrate that you really understand the stuff. And this is something that'll come up after the first exam, where if there's any area that you don't perform that well in, and we're going to be covering these first sections all the way up to number 5, so you'll have a grade for each one of these things. You can come and talk to me and demonstrate that, no, I understand this more, or I've spent some time in that learning about this, and now I understand it a lot better. And I'll use that as evidence of your grade, because your grades really should reflect what you know and are able to do at the end of the class, not what you did when you were first reading a particular article or your first attempt at making an assessment. As far as these go, there are 3. There's exam 1. Exam 2 is really a project, and I'll talk a little bit more about that later on. And then there is a final exam. The final is not cumulative in a real strong sense. It focuses mostly on standardized tests, grading, effective assessment, and professional models of assessment. But there is a lot of overlap as well, just not great direct evidence. I'll be getting that more from the project. As far as the grading goes, if you look at my grading scale, it's different probably than other classes that you've had. There is no percentage really tied to these things, although they map fairly well onto certain percentages, at least at the higher end. If we look at how the grades are described, right, an A means that you have demonstrated, or at least all the evidence that I have suggests that you have mastered this content. You understand how the ideas are connected with one another, and you can work very well independently. I have no problem sending you forward. You're ready to do this in a classroom or in the real world. A 10 is hard to get. That means that you have demonstrated so much mastery that I would feel comfortable with you just coming in and guest lecturing or teaching a class for me. And that's, that takes a while to get to that, but some people do. And if my evidence suggests that that's where you're at, that's what you'll get. Most people, though, get in between an 8.5 and a 9.5. The 10s are really hard to come by for any one particular content area. If you look at this then too, a B just means that you've demonstrated mastery of most concepts and you have some integration, but not all. A C means that there's some chunks missing. You're either making some errors where you're forgetting some things or adding in things that shouldn't be there. And then D and F go along with them. So it's a bit more subjective than raw percentages, but I think it provides a much more accurate view of where you are at. And I'm always happy to talk about my assessment of where you're at, and what each particular assignment or what each particular objective looks like for you. Now, I'm sure that people have questions on this grading scale. This is something that we can talk about more when we talk about grading in particular. We'd spend a lot of time talking about it after the first exam as well. But if you have questions now, I am more than happy to answer them. Then we have the course schedule. If you look at each week, this is tentative. It may change depending on how the class goes, but for right now, usually the first 4 or 5 weeks are pretty solid. To prepare for Monday, you have a couple things to do, right? Logging into the Cerigo to complete that module on Bloom's taxonomy. You will also get some reminders from that program to review the material, and I would like you to do that each day. Your goal is to get above a rating of 1 by Monday, and you need to not wait until the final moment to do that. I'm also going to be sending out an email some math material that I want you to look at, and I want you to write a major goal for lessons 2 and 3. In other words, what are these lessons about? Ideally, or initially, I wanted to go over this first, and so I'm going to be sending out a video where I go through lesson 1, so wait for that one too. Then there's an article called How Knowledge Helps and an online quiz that goes with it. Please complete that as well. Finally, if you want to look at the project, and this is really exam 2, it's outlined in more detail here, but it's something that we really will have to talk about later on in the semester when we get closer to it. We will be practicing for it right away, where we take some material and we try to identify goals and try to think about how would we teach it and then sketch a few assessments. So we'll be talking about it a little bit. But it's going to make a lot more sense once we get a little farther into the semester. I think that's really all I want to say about this, but there is a lot of practice that goes into it. If you look at the schedule, one of the things we will be doing, especially in the second part, is just basically working on creating assessments. That's really what you're going to be doing, and talking about how we're going to make sure that it doesn't suck terribly. Because one of the things we'll talk about in this class is that there is no such thing as a perfect assessment. Every assessment that you could ever come up with has flaws, and so we are just trying to minimize those flaws and try to get the best information that we can about what people can and can't do so we can make better decisions. But as far as the project goes, we'll go through math material, social studies material, science materials, and language arts materials, maybe more than once, focusing on the lessons first and then trying to tie it all together into a unit, because then our goals change a little bit, well, just slightly. And then ultimately what you're going to do is you will have a week, and if we look at the schedule right here, the week of April 15th, we don't have class. That is just for you to work on putting that assessment together. I am estimating that it will take most people between 8 to 12 hours to do this. I will assign things the week prior, so you really have about 10 days, almost 2 weeks actually, depending on how we think about it, to put this together. So make sure that you don't let other things pile up and that you allocate enough time towards it. It is something that you will be working on independently though. So make sure that you are monitoring your mastery as we go through all these different content areas and putting assessments together. We'll talk more about that when the time comes. But that's really it. If you have any questions, let me know. You can shoot me an email or you can give me a call. More than happy to talk.